So, Andy, thank you so much for being here and taking the time. For those who are listening who haven't read your memoir, The Life Inside, or seen the new series, Waiting for the Out, if you wouldn't mind, please introducing yourself and sharing a little bit about your journey and teaching.
Yeah, my name's Andy West, and I've been teaching in prisons for about 10 years. I started out in HMP Belmarsh, high security prison in London, where I live. And I went to Pentonville and Brixton, and I've taught in about 30 prisons now, including men's prisons, women's prisons, prisons for young people, prisons for people who've committed sexual offences, therapeutic prisons like HMP Grendon, where I'm working at the moment. Um, and a few years ago, I published a book all about the kind of conversations I was having with people inside, philosophical conversations that are kind of always interesting wherever you're having them, but maybe it was extra interesting to discuss freedom with people in prison when some people told me they felt more free inside than they did outside. And just hearing that and just becoming curious, really. I think the reason I teach in prison is partly because when I was a kid, my dad was in prison, and so was my brother, and so was my uncle. And in fact, my brother's partner now is someone he met in recovery. She used to be a prison officer for 12 years, so it's kind of a family business. Um, I'm just sort of going in with a keychain on my belt. So the book, The Life Inside, is it's a philosophical exploration. It's about the world of prison, but it's also about family and children and inheritance and shame. It's a lot about those kind of things.
Yeah, I for one found it an incredible read. It was really interesting. I loved the way that you really went also about your own experiences through these different themes that you were actively teaching. I thought it was a really interesting way to approach it, especially from a reader's perspective. I'm curious because you're also, I didn't know this actually, an executive producer of Waiting for the Out. I wasn't sure how involved you were in the process of its creation. If you wouldn't mind telling us how that went for you, adapting your story for television, and what you thought about it overall.
Yeah. So back when I only written a proposal for my book, I hadn't written the full book. I'd written a proposal, this very long proposal, it was about 17,000 words. Um, some producers got in touch and said, we could see this as a TV show, which I couldn't at all because it's so reflective. The the book, but there is lots of dialogue in it, and there's lots of storytelling and lots of images and scenes, and so they sort of convinced me in the end that, oh yeah, maybe this could be a TV show. Um, and worked with a wonderful writer, Dennis Kelly, and a wonderful production team, Sister. And it came out earlier this year on the BBC as Waiting for the Hour. Um, yeah, I was executive producer, so I was very involved. But it's a funny thing being an exec producer when you are also the author of the source material, because um, in some ways you have lots of authority, and you have your opinion is really significant, and should be significant because you're so close to the source material, and the kind of the realness of it. In another sense, I was in a world which was totally new to me of television, and there are things like casting or principles of photography and lighting or whatever, where I only had um, I was with kind of experts, and people who really knew their field. So part of, I think, that role is knowing where you're relevant and where you're not relevant. Um, and so yeah, I was very involved. I was on set, once a week for a couple of days. I was really engaged with the script writing and read throughs and things like that. But also, when I first met Josh, the guy who's playing the character based on me, I think for the first few weeks, I just wanted to give him lots of space, actually, and I wanted to not meddle and allow him to build a character that had a life of his own. And then we started spending a bit more time together, and then he would come to me, sort of asking for just about my experience and just about certain moods or sensations. Um, so yeah, so it's one of these things where like you're right in the middle of it, and in a way you're sort of the most important person, but there are then these other moments where you're not relevant actually because the story has a life of its own, and people are working, and they're much better at their job than you could be at their job. um so you need to know when to approach and when to back off, I think.
Really interesting. I'm sure that dynamic was, I wish I could be there to see behind the scenes what was going on. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I can definitely imagine that, knowing where to really step back and let them handle some of the details. Because the story, I would say, is quite similar to, very similar to the memoir. There's a lot of specific details that I really could see so many parallels. But of course, it is like televised. It is a bit different. Um, so I can completely imagine that. Um, moving on, in the book and the series alike, I would say as the audience, we really experience your first day very vividly. What I'm curious if there's something in particular that you still remember from your very first day teaching in prisons.
um I think security, just going through security, and the kind of humorlessness of it, the sort of trying to make this feel normal. Like when you go through airport security, you sometimes give a little nod or have a friendly exchange with the people who are frisking you or telling you to take your boots and belt off. Um, I just felt that wasn't like it was just this shift in social niceties, and just this signal of like this is a place where actions have consequences. Like you don't bring anything contraband in here. You don't even do it by accident. Um, yeah, I think the classroom itself, it was really challenging, and I was definitely out of my comfort zone at first, but I was also sort of relishing it. So that's different. I don't relish going through security. I don't. It's I, you know, I don't really know what it's like to be a prisoner. Um, I've 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 felt that way for a long time. Ever since I was a kid, and I had loved ones who were prisoners, and I wasn't. But I think there's something about the security regime, which even the staff have to undergo, which slightly puts you in that position of, you have to sort of you have to just do what people say when you go through security, and that's I can see why it's necessary, but it can also be infantilizing and difficult.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you. I would like to ask you a little bit about teaching specifically, so education and how that relates to broader themes. In your memoir, there was a specific part in one of your closing chapters, I believe it was Home, where one of your students, Nick, he reminded you, I have the quote here, that a teacher can do more than bear witness to the vanished. You can actually help people keep sight of themselves. And I was curious to know if you could tell us a little bit more about what that means for you now, and if that has any implications in your teaching still today.
Yeah, I think visiting prison as a kid, visiting my brother or whatever, and then coming back out into the world, um, and people just seeming so blissfully unaware of that, so blithe, that just a few miles from your front door is a prison, and it's sort of they're these really dark, difficult, complex places, and having sort of glimpsed the edge of that, and then come into a world where people didn't really connect with that. I think that made me feel sort of very alienated, and I think it left a sense of moral responsibility in me that actually there are people behind that wall, and I sort of need to bear witness to them. Um, I think, I think that's uh, one of the things that I talk about in the book is sort of actually, is bearing witness helpful or not, um, and does it actually compound a sense of kind of survivor's shame? Does it make things difficult, and is it actually helping those people you're witnessing? And so part of what I'm doing in the book is I'm kind of trying to grow beyond that, really, merely bearing witness, or um, that kind of survivor's shame, and trying to find something bigger than that, and richer and more dynamic. And I think that is education. That's um, you know, the teacher doesn't just bear witness to the students; they help people become their own witnesses, and become witnesses of themselves and their condition and their circumstance and their lives and their future and their past and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, for me, that was the kind of the insight, really.
Great. So actually, this leads perfectly to my next question, which is, from your experience or your belief system, what role do you think education plays in decarceration as a strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I know there's people out there who are sort of doing research to try and kind of prove the association between education and rehabilitation, or reducing reoffending, or whatever way you want to put it. Um, I've always had a much more modest hope for my lessons, in that I think it offers people a chance to be somewhere else, or to be someone else, or to be another version of themselves for a couple of hours. Um, just because the system is so chaotic and so disorganized, that actually the idea that your education could kind of be kind of structured and organized in such a way that there's a kind of pathway for you, just isn't realistic in UK prisons most of the time. For most people, education is an event that happens, and then people are often just thrown back onto the landing, and then eventually thrown out of prison, and then often to no housing, or further education possibilities. So there's a world that exists, and it exists for some people in some places, I'm sure, but where education is the thing that gets people away from crime and gives them more life opportunities, or whatever. I think we're very far from realizing that world, sadly. Um, but I think often with people in prison, the first thing people want to know about them is, what are they in for? What do they do? I watched a great documentary a couple of years ago about a musician who went into prison, and he did these amazing projects and concerts with young people in prison. But on camera, his first question to every prisoner we met was, "What are you in for?" And it's that weight of your past. It's the fact that your past, or an event, or a day, or a moment in your past, will now frame who you are, um, which is, I think, so difficult for people who've been convicted. And I think the role of education is, as a teacher, you look at people, and you don't. The first thing you see is not their past. The first thing you see is their possibility, and that's that that's necessary. If what was your phrase? Decarceration. I think that's necessary if we're thinking about decarceration.
Absolutely. I think that was a really nice way to put it, especially because in your book you also discuss trauma being related to your identity. I believe it was the discussion with the three different individuals where they talked about how sometimes it's hard to separate yourself from your trauma when it becomes so entrenched in your identity. But I think it's a really beautiful way to put it, that the role of education is to look not at their past, but at their possibility. Um, I was wondering, I mean, it's kind of a similar question, but do you think, in terms of your courses in philosophy, um, outside of this, like 2 hours, I believe, was it heaven, 2 hours of heaven or home? I forget the
A
two
holiday in the head, maybe.
yes,
Yeah,
holiday.
I'm
I knew it
definitely not
was
taking anyone to heaven.
that was I knew it wasn't that, but I knew it started with an H. Sorry. Yeah, the 2 hour holiday. I think that was a really good way to phrase your courses. I think it also came across in the book as such. Do you think that teaching more philosophy courses um, in or outside of prison maybe has what potential do you think that has in society? These types of courses, either in decarceration or other societal movements.
Yeah, I think philosophy is a really great way of finding out what you believe and what you think, and it's a great way of like finding out what you really think and what you really believe, and not just being blown around by the media, social media, online culture, the group mentality, whatever it is. Yeah, I think when people have the chance to think and pause, that was, I think that was one of the kind of big things that changed the direction of my life, because I left school with not a great GCSE record, and you know I've said sort of what kind of background I came from, so that's not a surprise. But there was something about doing philosophy where it's like, what? So people actually sit and give time and think about how they want the world to be, and how they want their life to be, and how they want to be. Like, I think a lot of kind of working class life is a lot about just adapting to what the world does to you, and trying to survive it. But as you sort of uh, get a bit more clearance from that, moving up the class spectrum, there's these opportunities that come through things like philosophy, where you can deliberate and kind of you know change yourself, essentially, kind of rewrite yourself. So yeah, I think philosophy is a huge part of people living the life they most want to live, ethically, socially, personally.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think even just using philosophy as a tool to figure out what your values are, even for voting patterns, for example, would be extremely beneficial. Um,
Yeah.
this might be a bit of a reach, so of course, feel free to be honest. Um, have you noticed a particular philosophical theme or topic that perhaps resonates differently between men and women in the prisons that you teach in? And if there is a theme or topic like that, why do you think that is?
I mean, one thing that really strikes me about the difference between men and women's prisons, it's not so much topics, but it's just the learning environment. So for men, they're often in prisons with 1,300 people, often quite unstable prisons, where the churn is very high. And I think a lot of men just survive prison just by shutting down, just by switching off a part of themselves, the part of them that might have needs, that can only be met by the world outside. Um, and so sometimes I'll have 12 men in my class, and they're all on the same wing or the same landing, but they don't know each other's names. And that's just because they're, you know, avoiding conflict, avoiding trouble, keeping themselves to themselves, just shutting down, going into themselves. Whereas if I go into a women's prison, there's probably 300 women there. They're unlocked a lot of the day. They know each other very well. Um, it's quite a stable population often. So when I walk into that room, with men, I have to create a community in the classroom. With women, like the community is there, I have to be accepted into it. So it's a really different mood, actually. Yeah.
Absolutely. I remember you mentioning that it's sort of this group that you have to kind of earn your respect in, whereas with the men, you have to use your courses to create this group.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Um, Building on that, in one of your chapters, I think it was forgetting. I think it's the same chapter where you discuss these differences. You described prison seeming much more brutal once you had been inside a women's prison. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think again because men sort of I think the way men suffer in prison is often quite muted or repressed or comes out in ways that are quite destructive to other people sometimes. Um, Whereas I found, I found women just, you know, uh, women would just cry. Something will have happened in the day, or the topic of conversation will go in a certain direction that's evocative or triggering or whatever, and they'll just start crying. And I've worked in prisons for 10 years, and I've seen one man cry, and I've probably seen a woman cry every time I've walked into a woman's prison. So there's something about just the fact that women register and reflect the emotional reality of the prison world more nakedly, I think, that makes you realize actually this institution is really, God, it must just be so lonely and so frustrating and so hard. Um, in a way that I think it is for men as well, but it, the cost of showing you that is just too high on the landing.
Yeah, I can completely see that. I mean, just with, of course, growing conversations of what it means to be masculine and feminine, it makes a lot of sense, what you've observed thus far. Moving within the same paragraph or page, actually, you also went on to say that you were reminded that prisons are one of the most forceful demonstrations of patriarchal power that there is. A lot of our readers and listeners know this firsthand. I've also become really familiar with specific cases that show this. And I was wondering, through your observations and experiences, what is the most or one of the most overlooked ways that this power plays out in women's prisons?
Yeah, I mean, there's people who will speak far more eloquently about this than I can. About how prisons are essentially designed for men, and even the way they treat men is very dehumanizing. But to put a woman in a sort of architecture and regime which is designed to incarcerate a man is doubly dehumanizing. So it's I see that but um, as I say, there's people who can talk much more eloquently about it than I can. Um, yeah, I think there's just something about just control and just the loss of autonomy, and that as a kind of patriarchal move, the sort of um fear of chaos or something, fear of loss of control. And this is the thing about prisons, right? Is that you infantilize someone for a number of months or years, and then you hope that they've changed their behavior when actually all they've done is just lost their autonomy. So it's it's further for them to get back a lot of the time. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Did you navigate these themes in the classroom in terms of maybe the architecture of the system or regime, like you mentioned? Was this something that you discussed with the women that you taught or with any of your students?
Yeah, I've only had a couple of conversations that kind of deconstruct prison, actually. Talking about reform, abolition, Foucault, that kind of stuff. Once was quite early on um, in my teaching career in prison, and I found the mood was just quite low because I think people have this sense that we know the laundry list of things that are wrong with the system, but the system will not change. And so people kind of reported being quite frustrated in that conversation. So it's a real mix because as a teacher, you want to give people a chance to relate to their experience differently, and if they have an experience of prison, then it might be really good to look at alternative philosophies that deconstruct prison, but that can also make people feel very frustrated and like they want to have another conversation instead. Um, I would do it again in the future, but I think I would. In fact, I did do it again, and I think I pitched it a bit differently. And I think I asked the group if that was what they wanted to talk about in the previous weeks, and then we addressed it. But also, some people in prison are quite firmly retributionists and think prisons should be tougher. And it's not just the case that because people are annoyed that they're in prison that they think prisons shouldn't exist or anything like that. Sometimes it some people have a very punitive logic sometimes.
Interesting, interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I can only imagine that's a difficult conversation to initiate, especially during the 2 hours of holiday. Um, from what you've seen, you kind of touched on this that, of course, I mean, I think a lot of us share this idea that the system or the government isn't, a lot of these things are not, there is not a lot of accountability. Um, but I'm curious what accountability would look like to you is, yeah, in general with inequalities within the broader criminal justice system. What would real, true accountability look like?
Yeah, it's so hard, I don't think it's more procedures and more paperwork because I think those things just get reframed and buried and massaged and all that kind of stuff. Uh, as a teacher, I've also worked in schools, state schools, and you know, every every September when I go back to teach in a state school, it's different to the previous September. Something has been changed, developed, built, some new language around mental health or special educational needs or how you teach English, how you teach maths, children's cultural religious identity. It's always progressing. And I think the reason is that 93% of children in this country go to state schools. And so a sizable amount of the middle class are looking what's going on inside that school. I want to know. I'm going to come in. I'm going to check. I care about it. I'm invested. If you look at, the 80, 90,000 people in prison in this country, if you look at the background they come from, they're often minoritized. They're often working class or underclass. Um, it's different. Things don't change from year to year. Things don't change from decade to decade in some prisons. The textbooks are from 1987 in some classrooms. I've seen them. Um, there's just a sense of neglect and drift, and working in a school, you can feel the general public are on your shoulder watching what you're doing. Working in a prison, you can feel the general public have turned the other way and don't care. And the people who do care, the fact that their brother or their dad or mum or whatever is in prison, don't have a political voice. So accountability for me is a lot about how open prisons are to the public gaze, and how much people care about what they see when they're in there. It's so strange, having written this book and made this TV show, because you have to be really careful, really, because if I were making a show about school or a hospital, and I was really exaggerating and I was really over the top, and I embellished loads of stuff or whatever, people would know. People would know in 2 seconds, because they go to hospitals, they go to schools. People don't go to prisons. And so the public are really susceptible as to what you tell them about how violent prisons are, or how corrupt they are, or how efficient they are, or how draconian they are. That people's ideas of prison are informed by the cinema rather than by any social reality. So how can you have an institution be accountable when people just don't know what it is? I think prisons just need to be more open to the public. We need more eyes on there. More people who care. More. We have inspectors. We have journalists. I think it's a lot harder for journalists to get in than it was before. But yeah, more transparency from and yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's also really interesting the perspective you have working in state schools as well, that you really see this contrast. I can only imagine, yeah, how deep that goes. Um, Actually, it's kind of related to schooling. In your memoir and in the series, you talk a lot about your own internal battles, which I feel are extremely important. And I really admire that as well, how transparent you were about everything going on. And a lot of these were, of course, connected to your childhood. And I'm wondering, how did that shape the way you understood your students, especially those who were parents or siblings, for example?
Yeah, it's a funny thing, because I didn't tell any of my students in prison about my background at all. Like for years, I just thought it wasn't really appropriate. It wasn't really. I was there to teach, not to kind of enter some kind of like surrogate kind of group therapy, family therapy thing. Um, and then when my book came out, I couldn't sort of. It was there. It was in print, and it was in the libraries and everything in prison. So people knew. And actually, I found people responded to me quite differently. And I saw, I think, a little crack in some of the guys I was teaching. Um, I think because a lot of guys are like, yeah, I'm in prison. I've had a number of guys who are like, yeah, I'm in prison. It's a laugh, whatever. I don't care. They can do what they like to me. Kind of, just using swagger to kind of get through the sentence. The fact of your kids, the fact you have a kid on the out or a little brother, and you're not there, and they're being bullied at school, or there's a teacher who doesn't like them, and you're not there, it hurts. I don't care how much of a bad boy you are. You you feel responsible for what you've done. I've seen it, um, and I think I represented that to them. I think they looked at me and they saw like, oh, like, okay, you've had an older brother in prison or a dad in prison, and I think I would tell people about my family history, and people would look at their feet, and I just see this kind of sadness, and it was difficult, and sometimes they asked me questions about, what did your parents tell you when your brother went to prison? What do you wish they'd said? Like how do I handle this situation? I haven't told my son I'm in prison yet. He thinks I'm in the army. He thinks I've gone to Africa. So yeah, it really changes the dynamic between me and them once that's out.
I can imagine that. Thank you. Um, I had an interview actually recently on the Lady Edwina scholarships. I don't know if you had heard. Oh, you had heard about them.
I haven't
Um,
heard about them. Is that Edwina?
yeah, Grosvenor.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. So she partnered with the Manchester Metropolitan University, and I just spoke with a professor there who she worked a lot with a lot of different people, particularly youth who were affected by the system. And it was really interesting because she said kind of a similar thing where she had no connection to the justice system personally. And she found that those who had some sort of connection, either through family or through themselves personally, they were able to break down these barriers so much faster than she was. Of course, I don't, that's not a direct quote, but so it's interesting that you say that because that's not the first time I've heard it, that there was like this specific, um, I don't have the correct word for it, but this specific dynamic that had changed with this information.
Yeah, interesting.
Um, I'm wondering also, um, kind of still to do with adverse childhoods and family patterns. What role do you think, for example, trauma informed or gender responsive pathways would have for your students, but also for their children?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of my own experience, I had lots of male figures in prison, but never um, female figures. So I'm very like women's prisons and the realities of them is a bit more of an away game for me, if you know what I mean. So I'll speak as sort of humbly as I can about that. Um, yeah, trauma's a funny one. Trauma's a funny one. Um, Interestingly, I don't, I talk about OCD in the book and I talk about shame and I talk about all of those things. I never use the word trauma to describe my own experience. Um, because for me, the experience was so linked to the justice system. Um, I talk about having an executioner in my head in terms of OCD and, this kind of dread, doom kind of voice. Um, Executioners work for the justice system. I think if I'd have called it trauma, it would sort of medicalize it and it would remove it from its context. Um, and so I avoided doing that just because I think it would have lost some vitality as a description and lost some particularity as a description. Um, so it's difficult because my own processing of my own stuff, I've deliberately tried to stay away from that language. So it's a little bit hard to then try and offer advice about trauma when I'm so resistant to using the word myself. Um, I know we talk about trauma informed prison and trauma informed regimes and whatever. Um, it's so paradoxical, isn't it? Because prisons are themselves a trauma, the social disconnection, the shame, the loss of identity. Um, I think the fact that, the walls, instead of being at right angles, might be curved now because that's trauma informed, feels a little bit cosmetic rather than, anything else. Uh, I mean, a trauma informed approach, the biggest trauma informed approach you can probably make is just community sentences, like swapping. You could probably swap a third of custodial sentences for community sentences like that, and that, hey, that's a massive trauma informed change.
Yes, definitely, definitely. Well, thank you also for clarifying. I really, yeah, the way you also framed the executioner. in your memoir I found really, really unique. And also hearing now why you chose to exactly frame it that way is really interesting to me. And I'm sure to our listeners as well. Um, Kind of wrapping up, I'm looking at the time. Um, for me, I think I just really appreciated the depth of your discussions within your classrooms and the way you navigated that as well. And the detail that you recalled it in was super fascinating. Is there a particular discussion, maybe it's not in your memoir or not in the series, from any class that you taught, maybe also in state schools, that really still stays with you, that you found to be very profound?
Yeah, so many, so many. I mean, I was in a prison recently, near Ipswich, where I was showing them clips from Waiting for the Out, actually, and we were discussing them. And I showed them this clip, which is based on my uncle, where he describes being in a Borstal years ago. And when he was in the SEG there, as a 15-year-old, he was made to dig holes that were 8 feet deep. And then at the end of the day, fill them back in, and then dig them again and fill them back in, and on repeat. And I was always kind of really wondering, how do you survive that? How do you not go mad? How do you not burst into tears? How do you not swing a shovel at someone's head? And my uncle just said, "Oh, I just loved it." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I just pretended to love it. I loved it." I was like, "So you pretended, you didn't actually love it?" And he went, "I pretended to love it, so I loved it." And I didn't really know if what he was giving me was bravado or spirit, courage, rebellion, or bravado that had become courage, or was this a mask, or was this his true face, kind of thing. Um, and I've shown that clip to prisoners a few times, and some people really admire him and his kind of spirit. That there's part of him that the officers, for all their kind of brutalizing punishments, they can't really touch, they can't break, they can't reach that spirit. Um, and then a prisoner said to me the other day, I don't think your uncle ever really got out of that hole. I think if you start saying you love prison, then you're institutionalized. And it really kind of gave me goosebumps because my uncle's passed now, sadly, but there was a part of him who he lived for that life. He lived for the buzz of the landing and the job, the work, the crime and everything, and it was sort of a place where he could be most himself, but it was also a place where he was most institutionalized and most oppressed, and in virtue of that. So yeah, just those things, just those insights people give you sometimes in the classroom are like, oh wow, he never got out of that hole. What way to extend the image.
Absolutely. And my condolences. I didn't realize yeah, I really enjoyed listening to your dialogue with him. And my uncle is actually also called Uncle Frank. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah, so I was trying to, so I really appreciated those dialogues that you included. Um, I'm trying to think of what I want to ask you next, but I am paying attention to the time. I think before my last question, in the closing chapter of your book, you were talking about Schopenhauer's idea that life is kind of this suffering, and seeing the world as a prison can actually make us more tolerant, patient, and kind. And one of your students, Kit, responded that, or noted later, that prison is where you learn what kindness means. And I was curious what you thought of that specifically.
Yeah, there is something, I feel this very regularly going into prison. There is something about the fact that people are in there in the fact they're in there means there's been some ordeal in their lives or their backgrounds, or Gwen Adshead, the forensic psychotherapist who works in prisons, puts this as she sees the people she works with as survivors of a disaster, of which sometimes they are the disaster. And I just think the enormous what's the word I'm looking for? Obstacle of prison, the enormous frustration of it, just how the circumstance of being in prison is so like, just the worst things have happened, and that's why we're here. The worst things have happened, and yet people still find most of the time, 99% of the time, a way to be pro-social and to be engaged and to look out for each other and whatever. So there is something about the fact that, like, yeah, people can be kind when their bellies are full and their pockets are full and they've got, you know, uh, nice lives and everything's going your way. But people can also be kind when they're eating prison food and they don't have much canteen and they're estranged from their family, or they never had a family in the first place, or whatever. There is something about that you do get a kind of rush of humanity sometimes in prison at just the fact that people do get on with it and are quite nice to each other most of the time, given everything they're going through.
Thank you. Yeah, I really liked that theory really stood out to me. This like idea, and what I think that means for society is really important, and how it humanizes your students. I think it. I just I really enjoyed that. So thank you so much. And I wanted to end on a positive note. On what do you hope that people will take away from this new series? Of course, your memoir has been out since, I believe, 2022. So what do you hope people are going to take away from this series if it wasn't from the memoir, perhaps?
Yeah, I think the biggest, like, the thing that's made me feel the most warm and fuzzy is I was in a prison recently and someone said, a serving prisoner there said, "I watched your show and I told my mum to watch it." Because I remember going to visits with my brother and, or, seeing him when he just got out. And I kind of, I suppose, developed this quite like perverse fixation with prison just because that's where my brother was and I missed him. And I'd be like, yeah, I've been watching Oz, or I've been watching Scum, or I've been watching like these like intensely violent prison dramas that were on when I was a teenager. And he was like, don't watch that. Please don't watch that. And I remember when Time came out a few years ago, Time's brilliant. And I love Jimmy McGovern and I love that series. But a lot of people were saying, I remember being in the classroom and people saying like, yeah, I've told my mum, don't watch it. Don't watch it, because in the first 7 minutes, someone gets shanked, someone gets jugged, someone gets hit with the snooker ball. It's all like, so when people say to me like, oh yeah, I told my brother to watch it, I told my mum to watch it, it's like, oh well, that's really fitting because that's what the show is about. It's about a family that have been fractured and divided by prison, and now this one character, Dan, doesn't really feel a sense of belonging with his own family because he's one of the ones who hasn't spent time behind the walls. So the fact that families want to watch it together is like, oh, that's what it's meant to do.
Definitely, definitely. And I think it ties perfectly to what you said before about prisons needing to be more transparent and how it's really important what we are putting as well in television. So to have a show like this to really open that conversation of what prisons are like and your students and what conversations you're having, I think is just beyond relevant and beyond important to have discussed.
Great.
Well,
Well, you've engaged so thoroughly with the book. Thank you so much. You've read it so closely. When you were saying bits like, "Oh, there's a section where you say this," I'm like, "Oh my God! Like, did I say?"
oh
Oh my
gosh.
God! Like, let me check. Let me check. So, but thank you for engaging with it so thoroughly.
Of course, of course.